Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission's third in an ongoing series of research webinars. We will periodically be presenting findings and outcomes from an array of our water research-related technical projects. My name is Mike Jennings, and I'm a Senior Program Manager here at New England Interstate. We are very pleased to have you all join us this afternoon. Today's presentation will focus on the role agricultural tile drainage plays in potential receiving water nutrient impacts. As it shows here, today's webinar will be recorded and made available online. Before I introduce today's speakers, I'll remind you all that one of the best ways to stay informed about upcoming research webinars is to follow New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission on Twitter and Facebook. Also, please use the chat function to send me any questions you may have, and I will moderate a question and answer period at the end of the technical presentation. I will now introduce Eric Howe from New EPIC's Lake Champlain Basin Program to say a few words to set the stage for Kip's presentation. And as you'll see here, Eric has been with New England Interstate since 2009. He coordinates the Lake Champlain Basin Program Technical Advisory Committee, manages basin-oriented research grants, and is the project officer for research grants in the fields of agricultural edge of field monitoring, fish passage, mercury, and economic valuation. So I'll hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Mike. So ag is, so Lake Champlain, as all of you are aware, I'm sure, has experienced some water quality issues over the recent, last couple of decades, rather, a lot of which are tied to nutrient loading issues. And from those nutrient loading issues, agriculture is a pretty big factor, particularly in some areas of the watershed. Around the whole entire watershed of Lake Champlain, which is in Vermont, New York, and up in Quebec, roughly 38% of the phosphorus loading to the lake is sourced from agriculture. But in some parts of the watershed, some bays, that can run as high as about 75% of the phosphorus loading coming into that particular bay is from agriculture. So this leads to a pretty large effort in terms of basin program funding resources that are dedicated to ag-related projects to try to address these issues. In the past 5 years or so, the basin program has allocated funds to support agronomists, 3 in Vermont since 2011, which adds up to about roughly $300,000 or so a year. Maybe that's a little bit high. I guess $200,000 to $300,000 a year since 2011 for those 3 positions in Vermont, and then also we added a position in New York, an agronomist position in New York in 2012 to do the same thing. Those positions all are focused on farmer outreach and education programs. They run workshops. They work one-on-one with farmers throughout the U.S. part of the basin to make them aware of ag-related programs that are available not only through the basin program but also through other government agencies like Vermont Agency of Ag and their New York counterpart and NRCS as well, and help them find funding to pay for best management practices and so forth. We've also supplied funding opportunities for cover cropping to organizations that work with farmers to help them apply cover crops in their fields in the fall, which includes aerial applications by helicopters and other field-based best management practices. We've also focused resources on some problem watersheds. For those of you familiar with Lake Champlain, this includes Missisquoi Bay, one of our more challenging parts of the lake with respect to water quality and cyanobacteria blooms. This is a bay that has roughly 75% of the watershed draining into the bay is agriculture, or rather the nutrient loading coming into the bay is sourced to agriculture. So we always spend a lot of time working on ag-related issues up there, in addition to working with our Quebec counterparts. About 40% or so of the watershed in Missisquoi Bay is up in Quebec. Other projects that we have funded or funded in part would include a project that's going right now with Agency of Ag in Vermont is what we call an Ag BMP database. This is a pretty interesting concept. It's a database that's being built by a contractor with Vermont Agency of Agriculture to help all the different ag-related agencies in the state, working in the state, communicate better. It's with also, it'll be KIP's shop. KIP is with NRCS Vermont, and then also University of Vermont Extension, to some extent staff here at the Basin Program, and a few other groups as well. We'll be able to access this database and find out information about farms. They know who has been to these farms from different organizations, what the farms need, what BMPs have been installed, and what the lifespan of those BMPs are, and things like that. And they'll just help streamline resources and communication with these farmers and reduce the number of visits, repeat visits to some of these farms. Another project, pretty large project, is an edge of field monitoring project. I think Kip will actually probably touch on this one quite a bit. But just briefly, this one is part of the America's Great Outdoors program. It's been running since about 2011, and it's geared to looking at best management practices that could be installed on edge of fields, ag fields, and how effective some of these BMPs can be at reducing runoff from fields. Finally, one other project that we're going to get rolling soon is another. We'll focus on another small problem watershed on the Vermont side of the basin in St. Albans Bay. That'll look at tile drainage, mapping tile drainage, and again the efficacy of some potential best management practices that can be installed in tile drains, and then kind of relating that information to the greater Lake Champlain watershed. I think that's kind of a nutshell of what we're doing here in the Basin Program with it related to ag. We have a lot of other ag-related outreach programs. We do our education and outreach staff work with farms and committees to award Farm of the Year award, kind of awards to outstanding farms in watershed that are working hard to improve water quality in terms of nutrient runoff and so forth off of their farms, and kind of spread the message about things that they are doing to other farmers as well.
Okay, so again, I appreciate setting the stage for us, Eric, and
sure.
I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm going to transition.
That's not all I had anyway.
Our main presenter here today is Kip Potter from USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service, where he's been for a number of years. And Kip coordinates the Vermont NRCS projects and programs, including, as the aforementioned, edge of field monitoring, some watershed planning, prioritizing NRCS practices, developing new practices, and he has a PhD in forest hydrology from Penn State. So I am going to work my best to assign him as a presenter, and if you bear with me. So Kip, you should have control of the presentation now.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Let's see if this works. It does. So as Eric mentioned, and Mike mentioned, I work for NRCS in Vermont, and we've been working with primarily farmers, of course, here in the state since the early 1980s on water quality projects and practices. And the last 5 years or so, we've been spending somewhere between $6 and $8 million a year on different practices and programs with farmers. Unfortunately, during that entire time, the water quality in the lake has not shown any significant improvement. So we need to make sure what we're doing is correct and efficient, and that we're getting the most for our money. And a part of that is consideration of tile drainage, which I'm going to focus on today. And up until last year, there seemed to be a general reluctance to, or disinterest. I'm not sure what all the motivations were, but there was no discussion or consideration of the role tile drainage may be playing in our water quality situation here in Vermont, particularly the Lake Champlain Basin, and even to the extent whether tile drainage was good or bad, what just wasn't being considered. So I took it upon myself here about a year ago to start pulling some information together, and ended up in this presentation. And I'll go over some of the information that I was able to accumulate. Luckily, about the same time, there seemed to be a lot of interest for good reason in the upper Midwest, Western Lake Erie Basin around this whole issue of phosphorus and tile drainage. The traditional thinking and teachings was that phosphorus doesn't readily move with subsurface water, that phosphorus loading is primarily a surface process, and there wasn't really much consideration of tile in the scientific, phosphorus and tile in the scientific literature until really recently. And what we know in general is that soluble phosphorus is readily available for plant algae growth. But it's only probably about 40 to 80% of total phosphorus. Bioavailable is only about 40 to 80% of total phosphorus, most of which is probably in the soluble form. What we've focused on here in Vermont in the past has been controlling phosphorus loading by reducing erosion caused by surface runoff. So our practices, our conservation practices have been focused on erosion control measures. And most of the phosphorus reporting in the literature and here in Vermont has really focused on total phosphorus trends, and the soluble phosphorus trends have not received much attention. And if I can advance, yep. So what we do know is that overall installing tile drainage may reduce phosphorus loading in some situations, and it may increase it in other situations. And specifically here in Vermont, we have the Champlain Valley, which used to be an inland sea, have heavy clay soils throughout much of that watershed. So surface drainage is very common throughout the basin, and also tile drainage. We have some watersheds with existing extensive tile drainage in our watersheds. The state of Vermont just conducted one study in Jewett Brook watershed in St. Helens Bay. It's about a 5,900 acre watershed, and 74% of it is in ag, and 72% of those ag fields have tile drainage installed. Yeah, that's probably on the extreme range, but very common throughout the basin. We also know that tile drainage is being installed at an accelerated rate in the basin. From personal observations and what we're hearing from farmers, we have some of our large producers that are actually buying their own tile drainage equipment. And the tile drainage they're installing now is being laid out in a much more intensive grid system, and I'll show you some examples of that here in a minute. So this is St. Helens Bay in Lake Champlain. It's one of our more impaired areas of the lake. Total phosphorus has been increasing over the years, as well as soluble phosphorus. But if you look at the numbers for the last 5 years, and total phosphorus is the top graph, and make sure you notice that there's a difference in scale there on the two graphs. Total phosphorus has been increasing. Over the last 5 years, it's increased 7%. Dissolved phosphorus has also been increasing over the years, but if you look at the last 5 years, there's been a 20% increase in dissolved phosphorus in St. Albans Bay. And this isn't the only place where we're seeing this happen. We're seeing this trend in some of our other lake segments and tributaries as well, this sharp increase in soluble phosphorus in recent years. So something systematic is going on. Also, if you look at dissolved phosphorus concentrations or soluble phosphorus concentrations in major lake tributaries that are monitored, you can see that we have some, like this Jewett Brook watershed, that have extremely high concentrations of dissolved phosphorus, and there's several others that are way above what we want to see. The in-lake goal for total phosphorus range between 10 and 25 micrograms per liter. So you can see that we're, in some cases, an order of magnitude greater in the tributaries than what we want to see in the lake. This is an example of the modern tiling equipment they're using and purchasing. It's highly automated. It all uses high-resolution GPS and laser leveling. So they can go out with usually a GPS-enabled ATV and actually map the tile drainage systems, and they plug that information right into the computer on this tile plow, which is in the top picture, and push a button, and the machine just runs itself. So that tile plow has a blade there on the back that the tile feeds through automatically and is inserted in the ground as the plow moves through. They can do, been told by the private consultants that are working on this, they can do around over 30,000 feet in a weekend. So that's over 5 miles in a weekend of tile in the ground. Just a second. Hey guys, I'm on a webinar. So this is expensive equipment. You know, the whole package is about $1 million. And you know, but that's what they're using now, and they're putting in tile everywhere. This is a field, I think actually from several fields from the Jewett Brook watershed. You can see the tile lines in this early spring aerial photography on the bare cornfields, and these lines that I've indicated here, like these up here and these here, are the older type systems that were in place. Usually they put a single tile line up a wet swale or to drain a wet depression. If you look at what they're doing now, we can go to another area of the watershed just over to the east a little bit. These are the intensive grid systems that they're putting in now with this tiling equipment. These, I measured these here. These are at 35-foot spacings, so there's a tile line every 35 feet. And if you look at this picture here, you can actually see a collector line that goes around the edge of the field, and it's all probably draining to one corner of the field here. So very, very intensive drainage systems are being installed using, you know, this modern equipment and tiling methods. This is what a recently tiled field looks like before all the, you know, the tiled areas get compressed back down again. The other thing they're doing, you can see here, they got a couple of depressional areas here, or one bigger one. they put these drop inlet structures here. So normally the water would pond here and just sit on the field. So they have a vertical riser that's connected to the tile lines, and that water, which normally ponds, is going directly down the tile riser into the tile line, and then moving quickly, out to a ditch or a stream. One of the issues with tile is, the connection that the tile line has with preferential flow channels in the soil. And this was a study, demonstration study done over at the Miner Institute here a few years ago, where they hooked a smoke generator, you can sort of see up here in the left-hand corner, to the end of a tile line and pumped smoke up through the tile line. And you can see these flags here delineate where the tile line is. You can see smoke actually coming up out of the ground along these flags. And here's an example here of, where it's coming up through some of these macropores, from the tile. And down here you can actually see little puffs of smoke that are coming up out of the ground that are actually coming up through wormholes. So these tile lines, over time, develop, connectivity through the soil matrix, oftentimes right to the soil surface. And, of course, these preferential flow pathways are bypassing, the majority of the soil matrix. So the water, even though it's moving down through the soil, it's not having a lot of contact with the soil matrix. Here's another example where they used a dye study to look at how the water was moving down through a soil profile. And you can see up here the blue dye is moving down along a crack. Especially the heavier clay soils develop cracks as they dry out. And then it's reaching a different horizon of soil. It's probably not as heavy clay, and then or it's not plowed to that depth. And then it's entering these preferential flow channels, probably worm burrows or dead root channels, and then moving down through the soil. And if there was tile below this, these channels would conceivably connect right to the tile line. So what is the recent research in the literature showing us about tile drainage and phosphorus? Well, it's certainly contradicting that traditional hypothesis that phosphorus doesn't move with tile water. They're finding concentrations of phosphorus in tile. Most of this is from the upper Midwest, of anywhere from 100 to over 4,000 micrograms per liter. In Vermont, what little data we have, we've found concentrations of 20 to over 1,000 micrograms per liter. So, certainly, within that same sort of range. It is lower than when we compare it to what we're seeing in some of our edge of field surface runoff studies that we got going on here that Eric mentioned. The event mean concentrations from those range from anywhere from 68 to over 15,000 micrograms per liter of phosphorus and surface runoff. The overall average being 511. So the tile water concentrations do seem to be somewhat lower than what we're seeing in surface runoff. This is compared to, one of the highest inlet goals for the lake in the Missisquoi Bay, which is 25 micrograms per liter. So again, an order of magnitude or greater difference from what we want to see in the lake. There's also a new Vermont in-stream standard for medium gradient streams that you see in ag areas for base flow conditions of 27 micrograms per liter. So again, way below what we're often seeing in tile for phosphorus concentrations. Some field level studies that were conducted in Wisconsin, Indiana, they monitored surface and tile water flow and phosphorus concentration and loading for a number of fields for several years. Interestingly, in some of the fields, the peak flow from the tile occurred at the same time or even a little bit before peak flow from the surface runoff. So, this clearly shows you how quickly this water can move down through the soil matrix, enter the tile line, and then move through the tile system to some sort of surface water. In those studies, subsurface tile drainage accounted for 42 to 96% of the total water discharged from the fields. So up to 96% of the water leaving those fields was coming through tile lines rather than running off the surface. And unfortunately, that one field that where 96% of the water was moving through the tile lines was a field that was under a no-till cropping system. And what the literature is pointing to is that under these no-till systems, where the surface of the soil is not disturbed by plowing, these macropore systems can develop to a greater extent and connect all the way from the tile lines to the surface of the ground. So that's a practice we've been promoting very heavily, for water quality improvements, but there may be some drawbacks to it that we haven't really figured out how to deal with yet. Average annual tile total phosphorus in these studies ranged from 210 to over 1,300 micrograms per liter. Again, that same sort of range that we looked at before. And overall tile drainage accounted for 17 to 48% of the total phosphorus and up to 49% of the dissolved reactive phosphorus leaving those fields. So obviously, tile can be a major source of phosphorus to our surface waters and something we need to be considering in the whole scheme of our water quality strategies. On a watershed level, we're seeing similar kind of results. In an Ohio study, they monitored fields in a small intensive ag watershed, and where 82% of the watershed was tiled. And again, tile accounted for 47% of the water leaving the watershed and 48% of the dissolved reactive phosphorus. And this study over here from the Ewing watershed in Quebec is actually in the Lake Champlain Basin. And this study, they looked at water yields and phosphorus runoff from groundwater, subsurface drains, and surface runoff. And the water yield from subsurface drains was 48% in the fall and 40% in the spring, and the total phosphorus from tile was 30% in the fall and 28% in the spring. Still showing that tile can be a major source of phosphorus to our surface waters. So just a quick summary here of what we've talked about here. In some cases, tile drainage can account for over 90% of the water leaving a field. On a field and watershed level, tile drainage can contribute as much phosphorus as does surface runoff. And this, I think, is an important point here. Tile drainage changes the dominant water flow pathway from a surface pathway to a subsurface flow pathway. And that's important for a couple reasons. One is that as I mentioned earlier, most of our current practices that we use with farmers are focused on reducing erosion, sediment leaving the field and the phosphorus associated with that sediment. And currently we have no implemented practices in Vermont that are focused solely on reducing phosphorus in tile lines, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. What we're going to be trying to do in the future. So again, a significant portion of the phosphorus load from ag fields, it can be from tile, and you know, this has been largely ignored in the past. And most of this phosphorus that you see in tile discharge is in a soluble form. So it's very bioavailable. So what we don't know, we don't know the extent of tile drainage in various Vermont watersheds. You know, Eric mentioned one study we have that's just getting started. The State Agency of Agriculture has done a preliminary study in Jewett Brook and, you know, developed those numbers that I gave you about the extent of tile drainage. So we're starting to look at that a little bit, but in a general sense, we really don't know what's out there in our watersheds. We don't know what the range and concentrations are, for tile drainage in Vermont, and what kind of loading rates that translates to. We don't know how tile drainage phosphorus concentration may relate to different factors such as soil type or cropping system or nutrient and manure management, soil test P levels. You know, we have some theories on that, but we really don't have much of any data at all to support those theories. And we don't really know at this point how to effectively control phosphorus in tile drainage systems here in Vermont or elsewhere. Some other folks are looking at this, starting to look at this as well. But so we need a lot of things, and I won't go over all of these, but you know, we need more information, quantitative information, data on phosphorus loading from tile drainage. The extended tile drainage. Yeah, we need to start looking at tile drainage as part of the whole TMDL goal process. You know, and we've talked a little bit about that here in Vermont already, how we might deal with that. We, NRCS and other folks that are working with farmers need to include tile drainage as part of our routine farm assessments that we do with farmers to document what's out there. Other states like North Carolina have some tools they've developed, like this phosphorus loss assessment tool in North Carolina that does include a subcomponent for tile drainage. And what we also need to look at, and we've just started doing here, is to test and implement a suite of conservation practices to reduce phosphorus loading from tile drainage. We have what we call this toolbox of conservation practices that we use primarily for surface runoff and soil erosion. We need to have a toolbox of practices available that focus on tile drainage and phosphorus as well. So certainly this would start with good nutrient management on the field, making sure you're not over-applying phosphorus, applying it at the right time and the right way. But it may also include other practices like constructed water, wetlands, drainage water management, which I'll show you a slide on here in a minute, as well as phosphorus removal systems. We have our first one going in here in a couple of weeks, and then maybe the use of soil amendments such as water treatment residuals. So what are we going to do here to deal with this? One of the first things I mentioned, we need to make sure that folks are doing good nutrient management, and it may need to be tweaked a little bit to minimize phosphorus in tile drainage systems. You know, I mentioned the no-till systems, how they may actually increase macropore conductivity with tile drainage. Well, we may need to start recommending they do a little bit of surface tillage to break up those macropores. We may need to adjust the timing of application to avoid very dry or wet conditions. in dry conditions, those heavy clay soils develop cracks that can go to a depth of several feet. So it really promotes the movement of materials off the surface. There's other things like avoiding applications directly over tile lines or around surface inlets. So there may be some things we can do with nutrient management to help. But as far as structural practices, one of the things that we're looking at is this phosphorus removal system. We developed a new interim NRCS practice here in Vermont about a year and a half ago that addresses this. It's a system that could include either subsurface tile lines. It could be built directly in line with the tile system, or it could be built on the surface in an existing swale or ditch where tile lines are draining to. It could be relatively easy installed in line. We're going to find out here in a couple of weeks just how easy they're installed. And yeah, the first project will start here shortly. And this is a example of what they might look like. This one here on the left is actually one that was put in by a researcher at Oklahoma State University, Chad Penn. It's a surface removal system. So you have concentrated flow coming down through here, entering this sort of box where the water is distributed uniformly over a suitable phosphorus absorption media and then discharged back into the drainage way again. And that's one of the big tricks. We've been working with Chad and research, a soil scientist at UVM and a private consultant to try to determine what the best phosphorus absorption media is going to be for us to use. We're looking for ideally something that is low cost or free, is readily available, has good phosphorus absorption characteristics, has fairly good hydraulic conductivity, and something that is either environmentally friendly or at least environmentally neutral, and ideally could be spread back out on the fields when its absorption lifespan has expired. So there's a couple of different media that we're looking at. One is water treatment residuals, which is, of course is an alum, mostly alum with a lot of particulate and organic matter associated with it. And we're also looking at a finely ground limestone as our first two media that we're going to test in our first system. And this is over here is an example of what the phosphorus removal system might look at like as part of an inline tile system. So this is actually pretty close to what we ended up designing for our first system. The hydrology is a little bit more complicated. The piping system is a little more complicated than what I'm showing here, but it's essentially a septic tank. They call it a ledge tank, which is shallower and wider and longer, that we're going to fill with our phosphorus absorption media, and it's going to flow through. And in the shallower tank, it's going to come in, sprout out over the top, and move down, and then flow out the bottom. So that system has been designed and will be in place soon, hopefully. This is another structural practice that we're looking at, drainage water management. It uses a water control structure to raise and lower the water table. These are being used a lot already in the Mississippi River states, primarily for nitrate control from fields with tile drainage. And essentially what it does is, you raise the water table in the fields using the riser boards and the water control structure to hold water on the fields over the winter months, and then you lower the take out the riser boards and lower the water table when you're getting ready to start field management and planting in the spring. And it's been shown to be very effective for N control, and it possibly could be, maybe, effective for phosphorus as well, or could in some cases actually increase phosphorus concentrations. So we got our first monitored system going in. It's already gone in over on the Miners Institute on the New York side of the lake. This fall. It's just operational now. That's going to be looking at water control structures and how and what effect they have on phosphorus reductions from fields. So that system is going to be monitoring both surface and tile runoff from two watersheds, two paired watersheds. And I should mention that the phosphorus removal system that we're putting in here in a couple weeks will also be monitored above and below the system. And so these practices are being funded partially with NRCS program funds. We have a new national edge of field monitoring program that we're using to evaluate some of these practices. The phosphorus removal system one is actually using NRCS Conservation Innovation Grant funds for that one, but we are looking to do a similar project using our National Edge of Field Monitoring funds, and we're partnering with Agency of Ag and the Basin Program, which has been supplying some matching funds so that we can run these projects at no cost to the farmer, and then working with a private consultant to get them installed and monitored. So we're looking to do some more of these types of projects, evaluating structures and practices for reducing phosphorus in tile discharge. We're also, trying to measure phosphorus more frequently, and this is a tool that's been distributed to our field people, a simple, inexpensive in-field phosphorus measurement kit. Measures orthophosphorus, it's a little colorimetric test kit, and you can run a sample in the field in 5 minutes or less and get a rough estimate of soluble or orthophosphorus in the water that you're measuring. So it's a good sort of assessment or risk assessment tool. So that's where we are at this point. So as a result of this, the discussion on tile drainage has really taken off. The farmers are talking about it. Agency people are talking about it. Seems like everybody's talking about it. As some of you may know, the Vermont legislature this year passed a new clean water rule, partially in response to the impending new updated TMDL for phosphorus in Lake Champlain Basin that's just being finalized now. And as part of that clean water rule, the state legislature has requested that the Agency of Agriculture provide to them by the spring of 2018 recommendations on how to deal with tile drainage in the state. So people are moving ahead with this as to try to deal with this issue, and I believe that this is important to us if we really are going to be able to meet our TMDL goals for the lake and other water bodies too. It's not just Lake Champlain as well. If we're going to meet those goals, this tile drainage issue is something that we're going to have to address along the way. So if anybody has some questions, I think Mike will coordinate those.
Yes, actually, I just sent out again through the chat function the opportunity for folks to send questions in that they might have. We do have a small number of people on the phone today, so there is the potential they could open up a line if we can manage that.
Yeah, that'd be fine. That'd be fine with me, Mike. Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a lag here for questions to come in. I'm not seeing any right away. Maybe, Kip, the systems that you have going in, maybe talk a little bit about how you decided which ones to go with and where to locate them, or how you are going to optimize that limited amount of information?
As far as any sort of structural practice, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we actually intended to try to, look at a number of different options. The edge of field monitoring program that we have now is available. It's somewhat inflexible in how they've structured it, but it is available to look at tile systems and practices associated with tile drainage. So we have been trying to get farmers to sign up to evaluate a number of these different practices. We have one for drainage water management already, which was a priority. We do want to look at constructed wetlands as well. That is one that we have not. This is a voluntary program, of course, and the farmers. There's not a lot of benefit to the farmers, to apply to do these practices at this point in time. Although we have set up the partnership so we can install and operate the monitoring system at no cost to the farmer. With a practice like constructed wetland, they do typically have to give up a good portion, an acre or two of land to install those practices. So that is difficult for them to accept in some circumstances. We have our one phosphorus removal system going in this fall under a SIG grant. We're looking at trying to do probably at least one more tile-based phosphorus removal system, and we would like to do at least one surface-based phosphorus removal system in a ditch or a drainage way. And we thought we had a couple farmers agreed to that this fall, but they backed out at the last minute, unfortunately. So we're going to regroup and try again next year to see if we can get some additional interest from farmers to host these projects. But we have got to start, and we're pretty excited about the couple projects that we got started this year. Was that what you're looking for, Mike?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's good. I do have a question here. It is, have you looked at the influence of soil type on how much phosphorus moves? Are there soil types that are more likely to export the tile drain than others?
Probably. That is probably true. We don't have any data on that currently. It's certainly something we're interested in. We have a little bit of data from our current edge of field monitoring projects, which are all just looking at surface runoff, that we have been able to show the relationship between soil phosphorus levels, their soil phosphorus test result levels, and the concentration of phosphorus in surface runoff. So we do have a little bit of information on that, but certainly, we need to be looking at soil type too as a factor there as well. Interestingly, from our edge of field sites that we have now that we're measuring surface runoff, we're measuring runoff from 6 fields that are in continuous corn and 6 fields that are in our permanent hayland. And overall, from those fields, 62% of the phosphorus leaving those fields is in the soluble form. So again, that sort of contradicts, traditional thinking that, most phosphorus, leaving ag fields, is tied up with particles or sediment. A lot of it is moving in a soluble form, and certainly from the hay fields, the majority of that phosphorus is in soluble form. Interestingly, also, sort of as a side note, that one value I gave you of a concentration, event mean concentration of over 15,000 micrograms per liter of total phosphorus in surface runoff was from a hay field that we're monitoring. And it was a situation where the farmer spread manure just before a fairly heavy rainfall, and that was the result. We got exceedingly high concentrations in the runoff.
You had mentioned utilizing water treatment residuals as a media. Has there been any investigation or information related to utilizing those materials as a soil amendment? How that might?
Yeah, a little bit. There's a private firm in New Hampshire, and I can't think of the name off the top of my head, that did get a grant to look at that, and what they found that they could reduce, available phosphorus in the fields. They weren't looking at runoff. They were just looking at, available phosphorus in the field associated with the soil. They could reduce that by applying water treatment residuals, but the amount they had to apply was extremely high, and boy, I can't remember the number. It was unreasonably high number, the application rate per acre. And so we actually have a new SIG grant with them that's just started up to look at applying water treatment residuals to critical source areas, subportions of fields, maybe along the riparian zone or buffer areas or other areas in the field that are more hydrologically active, and see if we can see some reductions from treating just portions of fields. Another one that we would like to look at is, as a whole treatment, field treatment amendment, is gypsum. It's been used for centuries, actually, as a soil amendment to improve soil qualities, but also has the potential to absorb phosphorus as well. So that's another one that we're interested in looking at as well as a soil amendment.
Okay, I think we've got another question here. We're approaching 2 o'clock, so this might be our last one, but are the values you are reporting from the stream or the tile outlet? And if the tile outlet, what kind of total phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus values in the base flow in the streams? Do you have the ability to correlate those?
I was reporting most of those values were tile discharge itself directly, out the end of the tile. Yep. Before it enters surface water. Yeah, almost all of those were, except for the ones that were from like the edge of field monitoring stations. Those are surface runoff numbers that were collected after the water moves through a flume just before it enters a ditch or a stream. And so I don't have a lot of information personally. That one slide I showed early on that showed concentrations of soluble phosphorus in Lake Champlain tributaries is probably the best information we have. That the box plots that showed the ranges and the means for our different surface waters, and those are generally lower, ranging, I think it was from from anywhere from maybe around 10 micrograms per liter up over 200 micrograms per liter. And so, the range that we're seeing in surface in the streams is lower than the range in what we're seeing in tile water. But for like Jewett Brook, which was really high, a lot of that water in that stream is probably originating from tile drainage systems. So, that's, we're thinking, is probably the reason why it is so much higher than what we're seeing in other areas.
Well, okay. I think we will end the Q&A at this point, and I want to say thank you to Eric and Kip for a very interesting talk this afternoon. Thank you to all of those that joined us.